Okay, so our next speaker is Jason Matthiopoulos. Jason got his BSc at the University of Aberdeen in mathematics and zoology, and acquired a PhD in mathematical ecology at the same institution. He then moved to St Andrews in 1997, working very closely with the Sea Mammal Research Unit. He got a faculty position as a lecturer in 2006, rose to a reader by 2011, and I understand he moved here in 2012. He spent a vast amount of time providing research outputs to the Special Committee on Seals. He has a vast series of consultation papers. He won the Queen's Anniversary Prize with the Sea Mammal Research Unit in 2011, so he's one of the few people I've ever met who's been associated with 2 Queen's Anniversary Prizes. He's also a chartered mathematician, which brings to mind a hilarious interview with John Cleese I saw a few years ago, which I won't go into now. It was a delight to have Jason move here. Graham Ruxton, as you'll recall, left Glasgow to go to St Andrews, and so it was very rewarding to be able to bring Jason over here. It was a sort of Jason quite rightly had a fairly long look at us. And the negotiations all seemed to be going very well until I went over to visit his family one evening and got a bit carried away in a sword fight with his son Spiros. And Valia nearly called the whole thing off at that point. Wasn't calibrating my energies appropriately, apparently. Anyway, Jason, over to you.
And Spiros would have been here had he not had to go to school today. So thank you very much. Thank you for coming. I'm a quantitative ecologist by trade. So I trained originally in mathematics and ecology. And I've been extremely lucky to be given the opportunity not to be kicked out of academia because of trying to hybridize 2 disciplines. It takes a long time to do it, but once I kind of achieved it and managed to cling on to an academic position, I rediscovered the sort of pleasure of doing science. And I'm going to stand here in front of you today and argue that ecologists should be doing maths. And that would have been the title of my talk, but at least with this title I get an audience. And first of all, I'd like to argue that ecology is important. Well, I would say this, but there's several very good reasons why ecology is important that we as ecologists like to remind ourselves and everybody else that comes within hearing range. Well, the obvious reason that comes to most people's minds, particularly my mother's, is that what we do for a living is to try and protect these charismatic species. And there's a lot of truth in that, of course, but ecology is also important for those things that we feed on. So we clearly need an ecological understanding to be able to preserve wildlife stocks, for example, or to be able to preserve pollinators for cultivated stocks. And you can tell that I'm not British because I've put a fork next to my fish and chips there. It's also important for things that kill us. And I've actually been shown this possibility by Dan, and it's the reason why I came to Glasgow. It's for the opportunity to do this kind of science as well. So the sort of question that we might have in this area is, what can we do to understand how much of a pest population can be sustained, how big of a pest population can be sustained by a particular environment? Can we do something to the environment? Can we manipulate it in some way so that it can bring this so-called carrying capacity down for this pest? Alternatively, if we can't do something to manipulate the environment, then can we predict where this pest is going to strike next as the environment changes because of our actions or beyond our control? Can we target our mitigation practices, spatially, for example, or temporally? Can we anticipate these outbreaks? Can we use ecology to do this? The ecology of vectors, for example. Ecology is also important for disasters we know nothing about as yet. So, for example, in a typically complicated ecosystem such as this one, what's going to happen in terms of indirect effects if we start removing keystone species or apex predators? If you start knocking out things from this web, how is the rest of the ecosystem going to respond, and how is it going to impact on all the other things that we care about, like fish stocks, for example, or pests. More recently, ecology is becoming interesting as a metaphor for our own civilization. So things that until recently were considered the preserve of economists or sociologists are starting to shamelessly borrow ideas and models, specific models from ecology, because ecology has got a head start in the study of complexity without a huge amount of prior prejudices about how things work. So this is quite an interesting direction. Now, okay, so ecology is quite an important discipline, or we can list the number of reasons why ecology is quite an important discipline, but it's important for us practitioners to remember that we need to be able to deliver on those, and to deliver on those on a daily basis. So it's okay to present those as token evidence of our self-importance to people when we try to get funding or what, but in truth, we need to be able to deliver on those, and that's quite a bit trickier. So one question is, what sort of scientific philosophy, what sort of scientific viewpoint do we need to take as ecologists in order to be able to deliver on all of these problems? Well, we can, for example, look back to the origins of ecology, so the group of people that spawned the idea of ecology. These would be natural historians, for example, coming right in from the Middle Ages. And these were people that were steeped in this tradition of collecting and archiving and classifying life forms for the greater glory of God. And clearly, this sort of approach is not going to be suitable if we want to answer systems, dynamic questions such as the ones that I've presented. So coming out of the Middle Ages and into the sort of Renaissance and Industrial Revolution, there were two directions in which science in general, but also biology, was pushed. And one I'll represent with Darwin, and the other I'll represent with Babbage. They both lived in a sort of similar period. And being extremely unfair to both of them and extremely simplistic, I will just say that things like, for example, the origin of species through natural selection represented a much deeper understanding into how the natural world works, without being able to give us predictions about how the world's going to go in the future. So we get an understanding for how we came to be the way we are, but we don't, through natural selection on its own, get a clear idea of what life forms will look like in 1,000,000 years' time. In contrast, Babbage's descendants focused on the sort of ghost in the machine. They focused on how machines can be programmed and how machines could ultimately become automata that learn from their surroundings and can mimic the real world without necessarily being able to acquire a deep understanding of the real world. So, for example, things like artificial neural networks nowadays can emulate the real world and can attempt to predict how the real world can respond, but they contain absolutely no deeper understanding into how the real world works. So my desire, and I think the thesis that I'm proposing to you today, is that these things need to be unified in some way, so that we're doing both of those and reinforcing one from the other. And before the Industrial Revolution, even before the Renaissance, before the Middle Ages, there was a guy who actually lived in that scientific nirvana. So Aristotle had a lot of things to say about how organisms came to be, and he had a lot of things to say about how machines can function and how we can learn empirically from nature. None of these ideas has really survived either Darwin or Babbage's Industrial Revolution, but what I think has remained from his heritage is this desire to bring prediction together with science. So I'd like to propose this as a starting point for us as ecologists, as practicing scientists, an area within which we could exist as scientists. So what's really stopping us? I have 7 big challenges, and if we think hard, we could maybe think of another 10, but there's only 15 minutes left. And what I'm going to do is go through those in turn and shamelessly illustrate them with some examples of my own work. not because they're the best examples, but because they're where I draw my experience for these problems, and I can speak to them very easily. So the very first challenge that we face as ecologists is that in ecology, determinism rarely occurs. It is very difficult to apply to ecological systems this ideal of a clockwork universe where randomness doesn't really matter, where cogs or where simple mathematical rules can be stated that can describe something like sort of Newtonian mechanics. Now, a good example of this situation comes every time you approach behavior of complicated organisms. So, as a first example, some work that I've been involved in the past looked at whether individual movement patterns can be predicted. So can you look at the geometry of animal movement by sticking telemetry tags on their heads, for example, and looking at them through satellites, and try and decide what it is they're doing behaviorally, and maybe try to decide why it is they're doing it. So one of the most astonishing patterns that we saw recently, just by looking at these data, was this. And I would say this is as deterministic as you can possibly get in this context of research. The enthusiasm, of course, dissipates quite quickly once you realize that the determinism in the animal's movement is really the result of human engineering. They're just going from one turbine to the next. But still, there's some system to their method, right? There's some method to their randomness. There's always going to be some determinism in biological data, but it becomes a lot more difficult to find the signal when you're actually trying to do something with this in terms of behavior. So for example, when you try to develop methods that try to deduce what kind of behavior the animal is performing from the geometry of the tracks, there's really nothing clockwork about this. My second big hurdle is that reductionism is a very limited use to ecologists. It takes us not very far. This idea that you can start understanding ecology from quantum mechanics or from subatomic particles is really a bit of a joke. But even though you can reject this idea offhand, the question is, how much should you analyze lower and higher levels of organization? So here's an example that I motivate from this idea of calculating the carrying capacity of the environment for a particular organism. Now, we're interested in this question because we want to know whether our environment can support many lions or a few lions or many mosquitoes or a few mosquitoes, so the practical implication is obvious. The tools that we have at our disposal, however, are limited. So the usual trick that people seem to try these days is to try a statistical model of habitat suitability. So if you know how suitable different areas in space are, you can maybe try and aggregate these ideas or these measurements and come up with a total population that can be supported by the environment. The way this is usually done is through these statistical models that take these environmental overlays, that take various maps for resources, for conditions, so on. They put them together in a kind of magical way and produce these measures of suitability. These models suffer from fundamental flaws, however. These flaws can be recreated in a lab very easily, or they can be recreated in a computer even more easily. So here's an example of an artificial landscape that I've created, and you can think of green as food and red as water. And you can specify in a computer simulation some basic rules for behavior for a synthetic organism that moves through this landscape. This is a thought experiment, really. And very quickly, if you allow the synthetic organism to explore its landscape, you see that hotspots of usage are created. So these are places that satisfy these make-believe rules of behavior and physiological requirements. Now, taking one of those statistical models and presenting it with this information allows it to recreate, to capture, at least on the surface, the behavior, the emergent behavior of this organism quite well. But the key question here is, how well would this sort of model perform if you change the environment that you're presenting the organism with? So here's a different landscape. So the landscape changed through global warming or something like that. There's more water less food, take this model and ask it to predict what's going to happen to this organism. How is it going to respond to this new set of circumstances? And this is what the model predicts. But the animal in this simulation has exactly the same rules of behavior, exactly the same requirements. Nothing has changed. You can allow it to respond to this environment to see what these same rules would do. And this is what you get. Now, this is visibly different to what your model would predict. So what is it that causes this catastrophic failure of predictive power for these models that we use every day to predict how the ecosystem is going to respond to climate change? Well, what's missing from this model is even a small amount of biological understanding for what these organisms do. So there's lack of biological mechanism from these models. So clearly we need to introduce some biological reality into this. But the question posed by reductionism is how much? Well, so here's the typical textbook level of or hierarchy of organization in biology. The question we're asking is being posed at the level of the population. How many animals can we sustain? We can start explaining this process right from the beginning, taking into consideration everything from the top. The trick that I would propose is that we simply look just a bit below and just a bit above. And when you do this, it actually becomes reasonably straightforward to train a model on population trajectories of animals living in particular environments, the red trajectories in this case, and ask it to predict what would happen in terms of carrying capacity in completely new environments. And this is a sort of quality of correspondence between the true carrying capacity and the one predicted by the model. So kind of a halfway house between complete empiricism or abstraction and complete reductionism or mechanism is what I would suppose, or what I would propose as a pragmatic compromise for us ecologists. The third issue I want to talk about is the effects of multiple causes. So just like a multimedia work of art, ecological systems and ecological data are made up of several different components that are interlocking and interacting. A good example for this comes from this idea of the decline of apex predators. So these declines have been observed across the world for many apex predators, particularly marine, but also terrestrial. As a biologist, the first impulse is to start listing the possible explanations that cause these declines. And these lists tend to be quite long. Biologists have very good imaginations. If you were to set up a research program that examined every single one of those mechanisms, you would need a very large budget. But worse than that, any two of these could interact to cause the observed declines. So you need not just these 15 mechanisms, but you also need all the combinations thereof. You could go through this entire list and find that not a single one is strong enough to cause the observed declines. So you have a very large list of possibilities. How do you prune this tree of possibilities? This is my suggestion. In the situation of a population decline for harbour seals in the UK, all we had to go on were aerial surveys and ground surveys collected over about 20 or 30 years. We were only seeing some of the animals, those that were on the beach, for a very small part of the year, just a couple of instances during every year. Our job was to use these data to recreate the population trajectory for these animals. This is what our modeling did. So this is the trajectory that was recreated from these sparse data, and there's two validation data points that were independently collected over there. But much more importantly than that, what this sort of modeling did was to decompose these dynamics down to their individual demographic components. So we could get trajectories for fecundity, for juvenile survival, and for adult survival. These results show us that the most highly mobile demographic rate is fecundity. So by this result alone, what we can say is that we're looking for explanations to the decline that are related with an impaired ability to reproduce. So we're looking for toxic substances that affect the reproductive system. We're looking for sublethal diseases. We're looking for poor quality food. Okay, so we can limit down the number of explanations and then focus our experimental effort where it'll make a difference. My fourth curse is that there are long delays between theory and experiment. Here's an example of work that looked at the possibility that boom and bust social processes could give rise to cyclic population dynamics. And these are particularly phrased for the case of red grouse in Scotland, where a metaphor between war caused by crowding between resource-holding territorial males was postulated in the 60s and the 70s to cause instability in the population. Now, we formulated this hypothesis into a mathematical model, and our model said that this would be possible, but only if there was some sort of mechanism that prolonged ambient aggression in the population well beyond the point where overcrowding has ceased to exist. Through a happy coexistence between experimentation and modeling, a field study was set where field colleagues went in and manipulated the testosterone levels in males and observed that in this system there was a cultural mechanism that sustained the ambient levels of aggression for more than a year, well beyond the point where the testosterone implants had ceased to have an effect. So these animals remained angry for a very long time after they had a hormonal reason to be. Now, the point about this, though, is that the whole process between the initial inception and the final non-refutation of this took about 30 years. Okay, this is somebody's entire career, potentially. Fifth reason, our data are often bad. They're very expensive, they're error-prone, and they're intermittent. Here's an example from some epidemiological work that we've been doing here in Glasgow. We've been looking at the interactions between domestic dogs and lion populations, particularly with regard to their exchange of the virus that causes canine distemper. Now, the data in this case were poor because there were serological data. So these were the raw data for lions. We had similar data for dogs. And each line here represents a single animal. Each line starts when the animal is born, and it ends when the sample was taken. Red indicates that the animal was exposed to the disease. Blue indicates that it was not. Okay, so given those data, our job was to recreate the disease dynamics. Our modeling generated these results for lions and dogs. And the insights that we got referred to the direction between the two species of the exchange, but also the relative effectiveness of the vaccination programs. The point about this work is that very often in ecology, the kind of modeling that you need to do of the observation process is almost as elaborate, if not more, than the biological process that you're trying to explain. Number 6, ecosystems are rarely closed and often global. So it's very, very difficult to do ecology in a lab. Very rarely is ecology done in a lab under controlled conditions. So we have to deal with a situation where things here influence things there and in the future. Here's an example from recent work being done under the Leadership Fellow Scheme here in Glasgow. Ewan collected a very large number of telemetry data for far-ranging seabirds, tagged all around the Atlantic, and analyzed these data collectively to discover that there is good evidence for a high biodiversity hotspot up in the North Atlantic. He's calculated that this area, by the way, is a high nutrient, low photosynthesis area. So there's potentially high carbon content in the area over there. So he's gone ahead and calculated that these animals, by transferring iron in their feces to this region, have the potential to sequester a very large net amount of carbon from these particular regions. Now, look at that in the context of climate change, and it becomes a particularly interesting phenomenon, because a lot of these birds migrate by using the existing wind fields. They could not possibly energetically achieve these long-ranging distances unless they exploited these beneficial wind fields. So you'll see here that these migration paths follow exactly the help of the existing wind fields as they stand just now. Now, under models of climate change, these animals would try to cross through some of the areas where wind fields are likely to be affected the most. So not only are we likely to interfere with the well-being of these animals, potentially, but there is a possibility here that we might be interfering with a very unlikely mechanism for nutrient cycling within the ocean, a biology, ecology-mediated nutrient cycling mechanism. So you can't really get more global than that. My very last challenge is that a very large number of audiences that we're facing have a deep-seated phobia of mathematics. I was never very good at maths myself, and I would argue that I still am not very good at maths. But I think those of us that have made this transition and hybridized the two disciplines really have a duty to the education of the people that we're addressing. So this is my effort in this direction, but these are some rather excellent, highly recommended books by other colleagues that I've come across. But I guess not all of our audiences are going to be undergraduate or postgraduate students. We're very frequently needing to communicate these concepts to policymakers or non-mathematical ecologists. And I think that's a particularly challenging issue, but it's one where I think there is hope. I think, for example, being able to give you a half-an-hour talk, 30-odd slides on mathematical biology without actually having a single equation on any of the slides bears testament to that. So I think that's all I have. Thank you very much.
So I think the message is clear for senior people, researchers, or people who made it to that kind of stage. But what about us? In terms of all the problems that Bruce mentioned kind of at the end of the talk. Lots of people even in academia, this kind of problem of combining maths and biology. And how would you compare that to when you were at this stage?
I think the odds are stacked against people who want to do multidisciplinary science. Traditionally, you would choose to attend two different schools, and the people in maths would have nothing to do with the people in biology. You would have to make your own bridges between the two. I think universities that have really grasped that particular nettle, like this one, are doing themselves and their students huge favors. I think it is, being honest, it is a disadvantage to anybody trying to do this sort of cross-fertilization at the beginning of their careers. It is a strategy that will lead to delayed publication records. It is a strategy that will cost dearly in the beginning. But by the same token, it is a strategy that pays big in the long term. You really, in the long term, if you persist with it, have this possibility of being a little bit like, the wizard in the village, where, people want your input to read the stars, kind of thing.
Similar theme. Do you envisage a day when a biology undergraduate course is actually quite different? You wouldn't conceive of doing a physics undergraduate degree without it automatically been quite quantitative?
Yeah. I think the answer is most definitely yes. Most definitely yes. I think this is witnessed by the fact that we've got a master's in this institute that does exactly that, and it is feasible that this will seep down to undergraduate courses. Many universities have tried this, including this one, not very successfully. But I think this is because we need more big success stories where people can just reach down to school kids and say, well, look, if you're good at maths, particle physics isn't the only thing you could do. But you've got to be good with maths. You've also got to be good with fuzziness, with complexity. And people who really embrace complexity are people who are ideal students for us, which is the reason why ecology students seem to be much better at becoming mathematical ecologists. And people might disagree with this than pure mathematicians, for example. I don't know what you think, but we can.
An excellent pure mathematician into almost an ecologist, so
yeah.
It's not impossible.
No.
You say that ecology is a predictive science. I think all science should try to be predictive. But I wondered how successful you think ecology is at predicting the future or predicting population trajectories. Often it's based on what happened in the past.
Yeah.
Trying to project that in the future, and one might argue that without a deeper understanding of the mechanistic processes, we're very poor at predicting the future because the past is not always a very good guide to what will happen next.
Yeah, I think we're actually being a lot more successful than people who are embracing reductionism wholesale. I think if you take meteorologists, for example, they've really broken this down, and they're sort of on a push for bigger computers, more clusters, and so on. And really, 4 days ahead is the best we can still do. So I think what we've done as ecologists, which I think is quite brave, is to really chop this anchor, if you like, and really look at emergence. Really look at this process whereby properties at one level take a life of their own that can inform what happens at that level. So I think it's entirely possible to be predictive while not being completely reductionist. And I actually think that we're doing a reasonably good job already, given that quantitative ecology has only existed for maybe 30 or 40 years, and theoretical physics has existed for centuries.
I'm sure I speak for most people in the audience in that I found your talk extremely clear, very informative, and you've got this mission to bring together biology and maths. Is it also an admission of failure, the fact that you didn't put in any mathematical symbols, any equations? And I'm just thinking, if you gave the same talk to mathematicians, would it be the opposite? Would you cut out all biology? We'd think that'd be ridiculous. So is it also ridiculous to cut out the maths and make it easy for us? Shouldn't we be actually be a bit more challenged?
I think it's reasonably possible to talk about mathematical biology up to a point without any maths. It's impossible to talk about mathematical biology without any biology. I would say that. I would also say that if I had confidence that the audience could marvel at the beauty of a couple of equations, I admit I would have put them up. So an admission of defeat, no, but maybe for 10 or 20 years from now.
Okay, we should wrap up. I used to scale cliffs in the old days, and when the cliff was steep and high and the weather was bad, you'd look down the rope and you'd think, oh, good. I'm glad I'm climbing with this guy or these people, and it's great to have such incredible colleagues to be working with and to be joining us. Thank you both very much for amazing talks. I'd like to thank the college for lunch, the college office for organising this, and Jim, thank you.